Hi, this is the second video dedicated to the crisis of Islam, a crisis that briefly interrupted the sweeping conquest of the Caliphate during the 7th century and gave some respite to the Eastern Roman Empire, which had lost already its richest provinces and even its naval supremacy. If you have not watched the previous video, you might consider starting with this one, because both of them cover the same subject, too rich and complex for a single video. In lecture 14, we dealt with the assassination of the third caliph, Uthman bin Affan, replaced by Ali bin Abi Talib, a first cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet. But Ali had then to face a rebellion of the governor of Syria, Muawiyah, who belonged to the powerful clan of the Umayyads of the Quraysh tribe. We ended the last lecture with the death of Ali, assassinated by a Kharijite killer in a sensational attack with multiple targets. From the Prophet's daughter, Fatima, Ali had two sons, Al-Hassan and Al-Hussein, normally simply called Hassan and Hussein. When Ali died in the year 661, his eldest son, Hassan, was proclaimed caliph in Kufa, while the rebellious governor Muawiyah had been proclaimed caliph in Damascus. But Hassan was unwilling to face a bloody civil war against an adversary who had grown stronger over the last few years. Therefore, after months of negotiations, he accepted to recognize Muawiyah as caliph. In return, he retained the right to the taxes in the region of Kufa, which allowed him and his large family to live a comfortable life in Medina. The agreement between the two also stipulated that Muawiyah had no right to appoint his own successor. At his death, Hassan would become the new caliph. Therefore, in 662, Muawiyah became the first caliph for all the believers, and Damascus became the new capital of the caliphate. It would remain such for a long time. A new era had just begun for Islam. However, the resignation of Hassan was not enough to diffuse the pitiless mechanics of power. The same in all times and under the whole heaven. It was not realistic to expect that a man like Muawiyah, ruling over the world's largest state, a state that he had considerably reinforced and extended, eventually laid his power in the hands of strangers, depriving his own descendants and exposing his relatives, friends, and loyal subjects to the loss of positions and wealth. The truth was that Hassan still posed a threat for the empire that Muawiyah was consolidating. Muawiyah was already close to 70 years of age. If he wanted to form a dynasty, he had to prepare his son in good time for the daunting task of leading an empire. And this was not possible without freeing himself from the obligation towards Hassan, a man in the prime of his maturity, rich in followers and in expectations. We will never know precisely what happened. The fact is that after 9 years of life in Medina, during which he had kept out of any political activity, Hassan suddenly became ill. There was a strong suspicion, but not the certainty of poisoning. The dying man himself had suspicions, but avoided to utter them in order not to risk endangering innocent people. Thus, as Hassan died in 670, revered by Shias as the second Imam. After designating his brother Hussein as third Imam and his successor for the position of Caliph, to which Hassan would have been entitled after the death of Muawiyah. After that, Muawiyah reigned undisturbed for another decade. Meanwhile, he managed to restore the cohesion in the caliphate, traumatized by the civil war, and to ensure continuity and potential for further expansion. He did it by a mix of centralization, religious tolerance, and non-oppressive hegemony of the Arabs within the new state. How did they work in practice? In Syria, Muawiyah ruled almost like a traditional sheikh, with a moral more than a religious authority. He displayed dependence from the consensus and the fealty of the Arabs. This Arab involvement in the government was ensured by two advisory bodies, a council of notables, the Shura, an Arabic word meaning consultation, which had significant executive powers and was summoned by the Caliph, and the Wufud, which represented the tribes and could make the Caliph aware of their interests and requests. Outside of Syria, Muawiyah took advantage of energetic and capable provincial governors, like that of Iraq, Ziyad, who was able to maintain inflexible discipline in that turbulent province. Finally, as we have seen in Lecture 13, Muawiyah was a very good military commander. He resumed the expansion of the caliphate, and the war contributed to restore internal cohesion. Muawiyah felt no longer bound by the treaty concluded with the late Hassan and was preparing his succession, a very sensitive issue, resolved in the past by collegial choices that had not managed to avoid a civil war. However, a simple dynastic succession would have been unacceptable in the community of the believers. The principle of consultation is rooted in the Quran itself. Therefore, although Muawiyah made the succession dynastic, he subjected it formally to the tribal parliamentary system that he had adopted. Together with the Shura of Damascus, he appointed his son Yazid as his successor and then let the Wufud ratify the decision. This compromise was disliked by the Medinese aristocracy, which declared it a heretical innovation, since it made the position of Caliph inheritable like any other material good, and established de facto the Umayyad dynasty. From then on, the Shura would no longer meet to appoint a new Caliph. Yazid would be succeeded by his son, and his son by other descendants who become autocrats and used the Syrian army to maintain their power. The Caliphate turned to be another of the many empires in history, although larger than the precedent ones. This is why the story of the four rightly guided caliphs still feeds the utopia of Islamic fundamentalism, as you can easily see on the web. Shortly after the appointment of Yazid as his successor, Muawiyah died in 680. He had become governor of Syria 40 years before and had been caliph for 20 years, i.e. longer than any of his predecessors. With his long rule, he left a deep imprint on the Muslim world. He was a crafty politician, a realist, but not without a long-term vision. It seems that on his deathbed he recommended to his son Yazid to meet as much as possible any request that Hussein might advance, to honor him in any way, and under all circumstances not to shed the blood of a descendant of the Prophet. He might have felt that the wheel of political necessity was about to turn once more, crushing many other lives. Upon the death of Muawiyah, his son Yazid, a man with military capabilities but tough and political inexperience, required, as new caliph, an oath of allegiance from the provincial governors and from the sons of the previous caliphs. Especially pressing and imperious was, as it seems, the request made through the governor of Medina to Hussein, Hussein, however, did not submit. Mindful of the fate of his brother, he moved with his family and that of Hassan to Mecca, where he felt more secure. Here he received letters requesting his presence in Kufa, where in the meantime a revolt against the Umayyads had broken out. Hussein remembered how his father had been betrayed precisely by the most vehement among his followers. He therefore sent one of his cousins to Kufa to make sure that the rebellion enjoyed popular support. When he received confirmation that several thousand people were invoking the help and the guidance of the third Imam, Hussein resolved to leave the relative safety of Mecca, declaring that if even the Prophet's grandson refused to fight against tyranny, no one would ever dare to do that in the future. He set out for Kufa with about 100 relatives and friends, aware that his endeavor could have a tragic outcome. And in fact, ominous news reached the group already during the journey. In the meantime, Yazid had sent one of his generals to stifle the revolt, and the cousin of Hussein had already been killed. Hussein informed his followers of the great danger and stressed that he would not blame any of those who decided to turn back. The number of his supporters dwindled, but most of them decided to carry on. When they came near Kufa, an army barred them the way. Hussein talked to these troops, reminding them that he had arrived there because his presence had been requested, but said that he would immediately turn back if it were no longer desired. Instead, he was simply invited to take a different route to the Euphrates, together with his followers. But once Hussein and his people arrived after a very long march to a place called Karbala, where there was no water, but where they could already feel the scent of the great river nearby, the army blocked their way to the Euphrates. They had no water left and realized that they had fallen into a trap. All attempts to negotiate an access to the river failed. None of the people in the region who had pleaded for Hussein's intervention came to help him. After a few days, Hussein and his followers decided to die fighting rather than to suffer the atrocious death by thirst. But as the battle started, in order to protect their women and children from the volleys of arrows fired by Yazid's army, they decided instead to confront the enemy in individual combats. And in those combats, over a few hours, Hussein and his followers fell bravely, one after the other. Thus, in 680, the political and military ruin of the Shia had been accomplished. The defeat had been crushing and irremediable. All the stations of the way to the catastrophe had been marked by violence and deceit. All had generated great sorrow and a sense of injustice. The rebellion against Ali, his assassination, the suspicious death of Hassan, the non-respect of the pact by Muawiyah, the decision of Hussein to respond to the call of the people of Kufa, which had almost the character of a cosmic protest against tyranny, and finally, his martyrdom in Karbala. All these events, worthy of an ancient tragedy, were bound to form the substance of a myth that would inspire hundreds of millions of people. They forced the followers of Ali to elaborate them psychologically in order to come to terms with the fact that precisely the most religious, the most righteous men had been crushed by the wheel of political necessity. The religious celebrations of the Shias carry the marks of this tragedy, especially in the month of Muharram, when the massacre of Karbala occurred. Every year, in the days preceding the anniversary, collective displays of grief take place. In theaters, dramatic reenactments let the crowds revive the various stages of the drama. This manifestation culminates on the anniversary of the battle in a paroxysm of exaltation, in which groups of flagellants walk the streets, flogging themselves rhythmically with chains. Others hit themselves with daggers and swords. Blood and tears flow freely. The centuries have not softened such public demonstration of remorse and sorrow. If anything, they have intensified them, especially in times of anxiety. They take impressive proportions, especially in Iran, where a branch of the Shia has been the state religion over the last 5 centuries. In ancient times, the story of Ali and of his sons produced a few peculiar beliefs. Some people refused from the beginning to acknowledge the death of Ali. For the followers of a certain Abdullah bin Sabah, Ali had been a veritable incarnation of the divinity, apart from being a prophet, and he was not dead. He had simply ascended to the clouds in the sky, where he kept wandering, and from where he would one day descend to avenge wrongdoings and establish a realm of justice on earth. An analogous belief spread also a few decades later about Muhammad bin al-Hanafiya, a son that Ali had from another wife, and who had was proclaimed his legitimate successor during another Shia uprising, led by a certain Ishaq al-Mukhtar, and put down with bloodshed in the year 687. When this other son of Ali died, many believed that he still lived in a cave of Mount Radwa, a few days' journey from Medina, tended by wild beasts and waiting for the day of his return. The idea of a disappearance that is not death is important for the Shia. This gives me an opportunity for a word on the religious schism that still divides the Muslim world. One of the results of the political and psychological elaboration of the defeat suffered by the followers of Ali was the transformation of a dispute on the leader of the Islamic community in an irreversible religious schism. At the origin of the Shia was the legitimist principle, according to which the successor of Muhammad had to be a member of his family. In other words, while the Sunnis recognized the eligibility to the role of caliph of the members of the Prophet's tribe and to their descendants, the Shias limit it to the direct heirs of Muhammad, that is, to Ali and to his descendants. There were other differences. As we have seen, Shias suspected the Vulgate of the Quran distributed by Caliph Uthman had omitted a few passages in which the Prophet designated Ali as his successor. In addition, since the Quran could not regulate all aspects of social life, the Muslim always sought guidance in the words attributed to the Prophet, the Hadith, and in the customs adopted by the Islam of the beginnings, that is, in the tradition, the Sunnah. The corpus of the Prophet's sentences, gathered in voluminous collections, became very important for the Islamic community and was the base of its jurisprudence. However, the tendency of the Hadith to increase suspiciously over time created a need to establish rules for their authenticity. The main one is the existence of a chain of trusted guarantors of such authenticity, linking those who initially heard the Prophet's sentences to those who included them in the Hadith. Upon consensus on a reliable chain of sources, these sentences acquired legal force, serving both for the legislation and for the court's pronunciations. The same was true for the tales concerning the behavior of the Prophet and of his companions. The Sunnah is the complex of traditional customs on legal and religious matters. The Shias do not accept all those reported sentences and traditions, but only those for which the chain of trusted guarantors is entirely composed by the descendants of Ali. Furthermore, they subordinate the consensus of the community about the traditions to the authority of the Imam. And, in fact, the other key difference between Shias and Sunnis is the doctrine of the Imamate. Initially, the Imam of the Shia had characteristics similar to those of the Sunni Caliphs, although its legitimacy derived from being a descendant of Ali. In addition, the uniqueness of this figure was undefined. There could have been simultaneously several imams, each one heading a particular Shia group. Over time, however, the figure of the imam was exalted and charged with other characteristics. Ali had been also a religious leader. Therefore, he and the other imams were no longer conceived as mere secular leaders with the task of defending and ruling the Islamic community, but as infallible religious authorities and as perfect beings, incapable of sin, as the only holders of a hidden meaning of Islam, secretly imparted from Muhammad to Ali, and from Ali to his successors in the Imamate. Of course, the belief in the infallibility of the Imam led to the conclusion that there could be only one Imam in each historical epoch. Interesting is also the contamination that the belief of the Shia suffered by the Zoroastrian, Gnostic, and Manichaean doctrines. All these three religions, Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, and the Gnosis, contain a dual concept. They conceive the world as a perpetual conflict between forces of good and evil. The divine light which is present in the human being tends to return to God. The darkness of evil, however, imprisons it in this world, obfuscating human knowledge and preventing the divine component of each of us from reuniting with God. According to many Shias, a particle of divine light was implanted by God in Adam and was transmitted through his descendants down to Muhammad's father, Abdullah, and to the brother of this, Abu Talib, the father of Ali. The two brothers had then transmitted their particles of divine light to their respective children, so that these particles were later reunited in the sons of Fatima and of Ali, Hassan and Hussein, and continue to be transmitted through their descendants. For example, Hassan Hussein survived the massacre of Karbala because he was still a child, is regarded as the fourth Imam, although he abstained from any political activity in his life, and so on. Passing from generation to generation, the divine light bestows upon the Imam spiritual qualities, which place them above other human beings. Without the Imams, the truth would be unattainable for humanity. They are the indispensable intermediaries between God and man. The world itself could not exist without them. In short, according to the Shia, it is unthinkable that God left the believers with the task of having to designate their own spiritual guide, or to seek the true religious doctrine by the defective human means of study and discussion. God must have given them an infallible guide, and not only at the time of the birth of Islam, but later on as well. Always, this infallible guide is the Imam of the time, and although he does not necessarily have a position of power, it is a duty of every Muslim to recognize him and to submit to him. But how to recognize him in practice? On this point, several controversies and even schisms arose, sometimes bloody ones. Of course, with the increase in the number of generations, the series of the Imam became longer, increasing the possibilities of disagreements concerning their succession. The Shia has indeed produced many sects, because occasionally at the death of an Imam, a few people recognize the next Imam in one of his children, and others in another one. For this reason, the main branches of the Shia came to envision limitations in the number of acknowledged Imams. The Ismailis recognize 7 of them. The Twelvers arrive at 12, but there is at least consensus on the first 6. All of them lived, of course, over 1,000 years ago. But how to reconcile the idea of a limited number of Imams with the need of their permanent presence in the world? The answer to this problem was the doctrine of the return, which has similarities with the Jewish belief of the return of a Messiah. According to it, the last Imam did not die, but simply disappeared from sight. In spite of his temporary absence, the Raiba, he remains the head of the Islamic community and has ways to communicate his will to it. This absence is ascribed to the contrast between the actions of the Imam and the establishing power, and to the persecution inflicted upon the faithful. However, at the end of times, the hidden Imam will return. His return is awaited by the Shias with a mixture of hope and anxiety. The last Imam coincides with the Mahdi, i.e. the guided by God, a figure that exists also in the Sunni eschatology. This figure does not originate from the Quran, but from the Hadith. The Mahdi will appear in the imminence of the Last Judgment and restore justice in the world by defeating, with the help of Jesus, who will appear after him, the Dajjal, the deceiver, a false prophet, who is the Islamic equivalent of the Antichrist. The Sunni eschatology contemplates the Last Judgment, of course, coinciding with the end of the world. This will be preceded by 10 major signs. Some of them are mystical, like the sun rising from the west. Since those signs of a cosmic upheaval will begin during the life of the Mahdi, there is some speculation about signs of the appearance of the Mahdi or of the Dajjal. Speculation occasionally used by extremists for their warlike purposes. Whilst for the Sunnis, the Mahdi has not been born yet, for the Shia, he was born long ago, but he went into hiding. For the 12th Shia, the Mahdi is in fact the 12th Imam, a historical figure of the 9th century who suffered a cruel fate when he was still a young boy. It would be too long now to go into detail, but both the Umayyads and the Abbasids, who followed them in the control of the Caliphate, repressed harshly the periodic uprisings of the Shias, wherefore being regarded as Imam entailed a significant risk of extreme prejudice. Currently, the 12 represent the large majority of the Shias because their belief found large following in Persia and became the state religion in 1502, thanks to the dynasty of the Safavids. Even today, the 12 Shia is the state religion of Iran, and the principle of the imamate is reflected in the country constitution. In spite of the difference that we have seen and of the recurring tensions between Iran and a few Sunni countries, the Twelver Shia is the branch of the Shia closer to the Sunni world. From the judicial point of view and from that of the social life, the differences are few. However, other branches of the Shia drifted very much away from mainstream Islam, to the point of assimilating elements of completely different religions, such as metempsychosis or the cyclical conception of time typical of the ancient world. There were many groups in Islam, both from the Shia's side and from that of the Sunnah. Many of them still exist, and a few of them are politically important within specific geographical areas, such as the Alawites of Syria and the Druze in Lebanon. Their beliefs, which have sometimes an initiated character, may appear very surprising. We may mention a few of them when we will deal with the Crusades, but they had little relevance for European history, which is our focus. More interesting for us is the comparison between the doctrine of the return and the millennial cults that proliferated in Europe during the Middle Ages, especially from the 11th century onward. I'm referring particularly to the belief in the advent of a Redeemer who, just when evil forces will take control, will defeat them and restore justice on earth. The kingdom established by him will never end, or will last for a millennium or more, and only end with last judgment. The doctrine of the Hin and Imam awakens also other distant echoes in Europe, those of the medieval myths of the dormant kings, such as the Welsh and Breton legends about King Arthur asleep in the island of Avalon, or like that of Emperor Frederick II in Kyffhäuser in Thuringia. Greek kings immersed in a secular sleep in remote caves, who will one day wake up to put things straight in the world. What is the origin of those powerful myths shared by civilizations having little contact with each other outside the war? The answer lies in the common origin of the Islamic and European millennialism. This is the apocalyptic literature of the Jewish people. In the ancient world, the Jews stood out from other peoples for the fact that they considered themselves the people chosen by God, and by the only God who created and governs the world and controls the destinies of all nations. This is a very powerful narrative. The problem was that it was often challenged by reality, that seemed to exclude a privileged relationship of the Jewish people with an all-powerful entity. More than once, the Jews experienced defeat, deportation, oppression, and persecution. The apocalyptic literature was a response to a collective grandiosity gap, if I may borrow a concept of modern psychology, necessary to carry on and to find reasons for hope. By somewhat simplifying, its logic worked as follows. It gave the appearance of going initially along with possible objections that pointed out cases of triumphant iniquity to deny a special relationship with God. Of course, when the logic of the explanation, the presence of evil in the world is undeniable. Because of the sins of mankind, demonic forces must have been unleashed in the world. And we have seen nothing yet. A day will come in which iniquity will reign over the whole world. The early Christians will personify this rule of evil in the figures of the Antichrist, the Muslim in the Masih ad-Dajjal, the false Messiah, the deceiver, And yet, even such a peak of iniquity does not imply that God has abandoned his people. Just when evil will appear to triumph on earth, God will stand out from his throne and punish the enemies of his people. The righteous ones will be secure from the cataclysm. After it, they will gather in Palestine and rule over the other nations, and God will rule upon them. The world will be free from need and injustice. Wild beasts will graze beside the animals that used to be their prey. To this apocalyptic literature belongs, for example, the book of Isaiah, a collection of prophetic oracles of at least 3 authors who wrote at different times. The book reflects the tragedies of the Assyrian invasion in the 8th century BC and the exile of the Jews in Babylon in the 6th century BC. It is a rich and complex text, divided in 66 chapters of outstanding literary quality. Some of them describe a day in which the mountains will crumble, the ground will crack open, and the wrath of God will crush the wicked and enemies of Israel. The book contemplates the advent of a Messiah born from a virgin and became one of the founding texts of Christianity. Also, the book of Daniel belongs to this apocalyptic literature. It was composed in the 2nd century BC, shortly after the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes destroyed Jerusalem and tried to force the Hellenization of Palestine. It prophesies that the Greek domination will end like those of Babylon and Persia before it, and that the people of Israel will triumph and rule forever over all other nations. In the 1st century BC, the Roman domination induced a further proliferation of apocalyptic texts, like the Book of Ezra and the Book of Baruch. Those texts inflamed the revolt that culminated in the Roman siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. The most famous apocalyptic text remains, however, the Book of Revelation, also known as the Apocalypse of John. The Greek word apocalypsis means revelation. This is a Christian text of the 3rd century, wrongly attributed to the Apostle John, which describes how the world will fall prey of a giant beast surged from the sea, which personifies the Roman Empire. But then a Savior will arrive from heaven, and his word will be like a sword for all the nations. He will eventually throw the beast and a false prophet into a lake of eternal fire. All the wicked people will perish, and the righteous ones will rise from their graves, and the new Jerusalem will descend from heaven and welcome the saints and the righteous, and they will rule on earth. There were also many other prophetic texts of lower literary value, giving a sense to human suffering by nurturing hopes of retribution. They will nourish for many centuries the imagination of medieval Europeans, as well as they fed that of the peoples in the Islamic world. If you have watched some of my previous videos, you know that we occasionally deal with religious beliefs, the study of which is necessary for understanding late antiquity and the Middle Ages. We dealt already with long vanished heresies and with still flourishing religions. It would be wrong and unproductive, in my opinion, to deal with them with sarcasm and condescension, as some people tend to do today. In order to understand the mindset and the deeds of our ancestors, we need to see things in their historical context. We should not ridicule the efforts made through the ages by our species to set transcendent goals that justify behaviors functional to human societies. Goals like the pursuit of justice, of truth, the compassion towards the poor and the weak, etc. Besides that, our experience of societies in which all transcendent values get rapidly questioned and mocked is still very recent and can hardly justify a sense of superiority. Time will test these modern societies, but there is already some evidence that modern societies are capable of inflicting themselves great damage, just as ancient ones. In the next lecture, we will resume the history of the global conflict between the Roman Empire and the Caliphate under the Umayyad dynasty. I thank you for your interest and for subscribing to my YouTube channel, where I am reading many interesting comments that help me a lot to plan and prepare future lectures. Bye for now, and a presto.